Welcome to InfoStream, your daily current. Unsure what to listen to? Turn to us for today's headlines. Stay informed. Gaza hospital strike kills journalists. Multiple journalists were killed in an Israeli strike. Conflict intensifies in Yemen. Israel's retaliatory strikes escalated the conflict. Immigration dispute continues. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was detained again. Trump raises crime concerns. Trump threatened national deployment. Typhoon impacts Vietnam and China. Typhoon Kajiki caused damage in both countries. France faces criticism over antisemitism. U.S. envoy criticized France's response. Evergrande collapse threatens China. The Evergrande collapse created a systemic crisis. Protests drive asylum system. Overhaul government changes were implemented amid protests. Trump-Lee deal announced a trade agreement and investments were secured. Multiple conflicts reported. Ukraine continues to fight and receive support. Russia's media reach expands. Russia's influence in global media is growing. Donbas faces ongoing siege. Evacuations and conflict escalated in Donbas. Multiple journalists killed in Israeli strike on Gaza hospital. At least 15 people, including 4 journalists and a civil defense member, were killed in an Israeli strike on Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, Gaza, according to Gaza's civil defense agency. The attack, which involved a targeted strike on a building followed by a second air strike during evacuation efforts, has raised serious concerns about the safety of journalists operating in the region. The deceased journalists included photojournalist Hossam al-Masri and cameraman Mohammed Salama from Al Jazeera, freelancer Mariam Daga working with the Associated Press, and photojournalist Mo Zabu Taha. Several other journalists were injured, with one carrying bloodied clothes outside the hospital. The strike highlights the ongoing dangers faced by media personnel covering the conflict. Israeli authorities stated they were investigating the incident, but acknowledged targeting a camera on the hospital's roof used by Hamas for monitoring Israeli military activity. This admission sparked immediate condemnation from media watchdogs, including the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, and Reporters Without Borders, who reiterated that journalists should never be targeted in war and that such actions constitute war crimes. Approximately 200 journalists have been killed in nearly 2 years of the Israel-Hamas conflict, making it the deadliest conflict for journalists ever documented. Prior to this attack, 4 Al Jazeera staff and 2 freelancers were killed in a strike outside Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City. The Israeli military alleged that Anas al-Sharif, a prominent Al Jazeera correspondent killed in that strike, headed a Hamas terrorist cell and was responsible for advancing rocket attacks against Israelis, an assertion vehemently denied by Al Jazeera. The attack underscores the challenges journalists face in reporting from Gaza, including restricted access, the risk of being caught in the crossfire, and the deliberate targeting of media personnel. The incident has renewed calls for an immediate ceasefire and for international protection of journalists operating in conflict zones. The ongoing conflict has resulted in the deaths of over 66 Palestinians, mostly civilians, according to the Hamas-run health ministry, while the UN considers this figure reliable. The situation continues to pose significant risks for media operations and the safety of those reporting on the ground. Israel's retaliatory strikes intensify conflict in Yemen. Israel has escalated its military campaign against Houthi targets in Yemen, conducting extensive airstrikes in response to the group's attacks on Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu asserted that the Iran-backed Houthi movement was enduring a heavy price for its aggression. The latest operation targeted Sana'a, Yemen's capital, specifically destroying the presidential palace and the city's power station. Houthi officials reported 4 fatalities resulting from the strikes, while Israel confirmed the attacks. A key element of the conflict involves the use of cluster munitions by the Houthi forces. Israel's retaliatory strikes were triggered by reports that the Houthi attack on Israel utilized these banned weapons. The IDF investigation is focused on why the missile carrying the munitions evaded interception before dispersing into multiple bomblets. Cluster munitions, a significant concern due to their indiscriminate nature and potential for long-term danger, are designed to scatter numerous small, explosive devices over a wide area. Following the Sana'a assault, a bomblet from the dispersed munitions landed in the yard of a home in the Israeli town of Jinatan, causing minor damage. The IDF is actively investigating the circumstances surrounding the failure to intercept the missile. The Houthi group released a video depicting the dispersal of the bombs mid-air, further highlighting the complexity of the situation. The conflict has broader implications, with Israel's actions signaling a firm stance against threats emanating from Yemen. Netanyahu emphasized the state of Israel's power and determination in the region. Simultaneously, other global events are unfolding. including Serbia's efforts to quell anti-government demonstrations through measures to lower the cost of living, and reports on Spotify playlist habits of influential figures. Furthermore, amidst the ongoing conflict in Gaza, children are engaged in music education. The situation remains volatile, with ongoing investigations into the interception failure and the continued deployment of dangerous weaponry. Kilmar Abrego Garcia detained again amidst deportation controversy. Salvadoran national Kilmar Abrego Garcia has been detained again by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the ICE, following a series of increasingly complex legal battles and deportation attempts. The core of the issue revolves around his potential deportation, initially to Uganda, and subsequent charges related to human smuggling. Garcia was initially mistakenly deported to El Salvador's notorious Siquio prison in March, only to be swiftly returned to the United States. He was subsequently detained in Tennessee on human smuggling charges after being released from the prison. The government's strategy involved offering Garcia a guilty plea to human smuggling in exchange for deportation to Costa Rica, which he rejected. ICE's actions are being viewed as punitive, with his legal team arguing they are attempting to coerce a guilty plea through detention and the threat of indefinite deportation. The legal team highlights a supposed administrative error as the cause of the initial misdeportation. Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem confirmed the arrest, stating that ICE is processing him for deportation. The attempted deportation to Uganda, a country where Garcia has no known ties, has added a significant layer of complexity and controversy to the case. Documents obtained by CBS News reveal Uganda's preference for accepting individuals from African nations. The case has drawn criticism from legal scholars and human rights advocates who accuse the administration of a haphazard approach to deportation, potentially violating basic U.S. law by bypassing court hearings. The situation underscores a broader debate about immigration policies under the Trump administration and its impact on vulnerable individuals. The detention is linked to an ongoing effort to pressure jurisdictions to eliminate cashless bail policies, a move President Trump has publicly supported. Garcia denies the charges and maintains his innocence, while the administration alleges he is involved with the MS-13 gang. The saga continues to be a test case for the administration's immigration policies and a focal point for criticism of its tactics. Trump threatens national deployment amidst crime concerns. Recent news reports detail escalating tensions between President Donald Trump and several state and local governments following Trump's threats to deploy National Guard troops to cities including Baltimore, Chicago, and potentially New York, ostensibly to combat rising crime rates. These actions stem from Trump's assertion of out-of-control crime and his desire to intervene, prompting widespread criticism and legal concerns. Trump's initial provocation was a social media post referencing Maryland Governor Wes Moore's invitation for a safety walk in Baltimore, leading to a confrontational exchange. He subsequently declared his intention to clean up the crime, if needed, employing the imagery of deploying troops similar to those used in Washington, D.C. The deployment of National Guard units, already present in Washington, D.C., has seen a shift with the authorization for members to carry weapons, a departure from previous guidelines. This expansion has raised significant legal questions regarding the limits of presidential authority and the potential for federal intervention in domestic law enforcement. Several governors, including Moore and Illinois' Governor J.B. Pritzker, have strongly condemned Trump's actions, characterizing them as an abuse of power and a disregard for state sovereignty. They emphasize the importance of supporting local law enforcement and addressing underlying issues like mental health and gun violence. Crime statistics in cities targeted by Trump paint a different picture. Data from Washington, D.C. shows significant declines in violent crime rates over the past year, while Chicago has also experienced reductions in homicides and shootings. These figures contradict Trump's claims and fuel skepticism about his motivations. Democrats, including House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and Illinois Attorney General Kwame Rail, have voiced concerns about the potential for federalization of state law enforcement and the disruption of established community policing initiatives. They highlight the need for a comprehensive approach to crime reduction, focusing on addressing root causes and supporting local communities. Furthermore, the potential for federal intervention raises questions about resource allocation and the impact on federal agencies, such as the FBI and DEA, which already play a role in combating crime. Concerns have been expressed about the sustainability of prolonged National Guard deployments and the potential for legal challenges. The situation underscores a deepening political divide and raises fundamental questions about the balance of power between the federal government and the states. The actions are viewed as a deliberate attempt to manufacture a crisis and justify a dramatic expansion of presidential authority, particularly as Trump seeks to leverage these concerns for political gain. Typhoon Kajiki impacts Vietnam and China. Typhoon Kajiki is causing widespread disruption across Vietnam and China, bringing heavy rains, strong winds, and a heightened risk of flooding and landslides. The storm's intensity has prompted mass evacuations and emergency responses in both countries. In Vietnam, authorities have ordered the evacuation of over 586,000 people from coastal provinces including Ha Tinh, Thanh Ho, Quang Tri, and Da Nang. The storm's initial landfall occurred along Vietnam's northern central coast, with sustained winds reaching up to 166 kilometers per hour. Multiple airports and train lines have been temporarily suspended, and concerns are mounting about potential damage to infrastructure and agricultural lands. 6 provinces are facing a heightened risk of flash floods and landslides. Numerous electronics manufacturers, including Apple suppliers, have factories in the affected areas, necessitating further evacuations. Over 120,000 soldiers are deployed to assist with evacuations and preparedness. Simultaneously, China's Sanya City has taken drastic measures to prepare for the storm. Businesses have been closed, public transport suspended, and tourist attractions shuttered. The city is bracing for heavy rainfall and strong winds as the storm passes near Hainan Island, with forecasts predicting up to 320 millimeters of rain. The China Meteorological Administration reports that the storm is expected to weaken as it moves inland, bringing heavy rain to Laos. The storm's intensity is comparable to that of Typhoon Yagi, which devastated Vietnam less than a year prior, highlighting the ongoing threat posed by extreme weather events. The U.S. Navy's Joint Typhoon Warning Center notes that Kajiki's weakening is due to cooler deep ocean water upwelling. Both Vietnam and China are implementing precautionary measures to mitigate the storm's impact, emphasizing the need for continued vigilance and preparedness. The storm's trajectory and intensity remain closely monitored by meteorological agencies. U.S. Envoy criticizes France over antisemitism response. A growing diplomatic row has emerged following a letter penned by U.S. Ambassador to Paris, Charles Kushner, criticizing the French government's handling of rising antisemitism within France. The letter, leaked to the media, prompted a formal summons from the French Foreign Ministry, scheduled for Monday. Kushner's concerns center on what he perceives as a lack of sufficient action by the French government to confront the surge in anti-Semitic incidents since the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel and the subsequent escalation of the Gaza conflict. Kushner highlighted the alarming frequency of assaults on Jewish individuals and property, including attacks on streets, synagogues, and Jewish-owned businesses, emphasizing that these incidents have dramatically increased since the start of the war. He referenced the 81st anniversary of the liberation of Paris, underscoring the historical context of Jewish persecution under Nazi occupation. The French ministry strongly refuted Kushner's allegations, asserting that they are unacceptable, and that the ambassador's criticism is a violation of the 1961 Vienna Convention, which prohibits interference in a country's internal affairs. The ministry reiterated France's commitment to combating antisemitism and condemned the Hamas attack, while also expressing concern over the impact of French criticisms of Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has echoed Kushner's sentiments, accusing President Emmanuel Macron of fueling antisemitism through his calls for international recognition of a Palestinian state. Netanyahu contends that such moves embolden extremists and endanger Jewish life in France. The issue is further complicated by France's planned recognition of a Palestinian state in September, a move that has drawn condemnation from Israel and the U.S. Numerous Western nations, including Australia and Portugal, are also considering recognizing a Palestinian state, adding to the pressure on France. Both France and Israel grapple with heightened hate crimes following the conflict, with significant Jewish and Muslim populations experiencing increased tensions. The situation highlights a complex interplay of geopolitical concerns, security threats, and historical sensitivities. The core of the dispute revolves around the French government's stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and its perceived impact on the safety and security of France's Jewish community. Evergrande collapse, a systemic crisis in China. The collapse of Evergrande, China's once dominant property giant, represents a significant and multifaceted crisis with profound implications for the Chinese economy and global markets. Following a protracted period of aggressive expansion fueled by $300 billion in debt, Evergrande's troubles culminated in a winding-up order by the Hong Kong High Court in January 2024, triggered by its inability to meet debt obligations. This led to the delisting of its shares from the Hong Kong stock market, marking a final chapter in the company's tumultuous history. Founded in 1996 by Hui Ka-yen, Evergrande had grown to encompass over 300 development projects across 280 cities, alongside ventures in wealth management, electric vehicles through its ownership of Guangzhou FC, and other sectors. However, stricter regulations implemented by the Chinese government in 2020 aimed at curbing excessive borrowing by developers proved devastating. Forced to offer properties at discounted rates to maintain cash flow, Evergrande struggled to meet interest payments, leading to a default and subsequent bankruptcy filing in New York. The crisis has been exacerbated by the substantial contribution of the property sector, approximately one-third of China's GDP, and its impact on local government revenue. The collapse has triggered widespread layoffs within the construction industry and significant reductions in pay for real estate employees. Furthermore, many Chinese families who had invested their savings in property have seen their wealth diminish, impacting consumer spending, a key area of focus for the Chinese government. The situation is compounded by broader economic challenges facing China, including tariffs imposed by the U.S., high local government debt, weak consumer confidence, and an aging population. Beijing has responded with a series of initiatives, including support for new homebuyers and incentives for electric car and household goods purchases. But the effectiveness of these measures remains uncertain. Several other Chinese property firms now face similar challenges, with China South City Holdings also being forced into liquidation. Country Garden is currently attempting to negotiate a deal with its creditors to write off over $14 billion in foreign debt, with its next High Court liquidation hearing scheduled for January 2026. The systemic nature of the crisis underscores the vulnerability of China's economy to real estate sector instability, highlighting the need for continued efforts to stabilize the market and mitigate potential risks. The situation is ongoing, with the focus shifting to the orderly liquidation process and its long-term consequences for the Chinese economy. Government overhaul of asylum appeals system amidst ongoing protests. The UK government is implementing a significant overhaul of its asylum appeals process and simultaneously addressing escalating anti-migrant protests centered around the use of hotels to house asylum seekers. Driven by public concern over immigration and a record high in asylum claims, the Labour government, led by Prime Minister Keir Starmer, is under pressure to resolve the ongoing crisis. A key element of the strategy involves creating an independent body of adjudicators to expedite asylum appeals, aiming to reduce a backlog of 106,000 cases, including 51,000 with average wait times exceeding a year. This initiative is intended to restore control and order to a system deemed in complete chaos since Labour's takeover. Simultaneously, anti-migrant protests continue across the country, primarily focused on hotels used to house asylum seekers. These demonstrations, often accompanied by counter-protests, have been particularly intense in locations such as Epping, Bristol, Birmingham, and London. Recent events, including a sexual assault case involving a migrant housed in a hotel in Epping, have fueled the unrest. On Saturday, smaller-scale rallies occurred in towns and cities across England, Scotland, and Wales. On Sunday, demonstrations persisted, with protesters displaying banners reading "Aping says no" and "Stop the boats." The government's efforts to phase out hotel use are intertwined with legal challenges. A High Court ruling on Tuesday ordered the removal of asylum seekers from the Epping Hotel, a decision the government intends to appeal. Official figures reveal a record number of asylum claims, contributing to the increased reliance on hotels. Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage, proposes even more drastic measures, including withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights, establishing holding sites for 24,000 migrants, and mass deportations. The government's focus on streamlining the appeals process reflects a broader strategy to manage the asylum system and respond to public anxieties surrounding immigration. The situation remains complex, with legal challenges, ongoing protests, and significant logistical hurdles. Trump-Lee deal trade agreement and investment commitments. President Lee Jae-myung of South Korea is meeting with Donald Trump today, a meeting heavily anticipated due to ongoing trade discussions. A significant trade agreement has already been reached between the two nations, reducing South Korea's tariff on imports from 25% to 15%, specifically targeting automobiles and semiconductors, two of the country's primary exports to the United States. This reduction follows Trump's initial announcement of the tariff, aiming for a full and complete trade deal. However, certain sectors will remain subject to higher tariffs. Steel and aluminum, crucial exports for South Korea, will be taxed at 50%, aligning with Trump's existing global tariff rates. This strategic approach reflects Trump's continued focus on protecting American industries. A key element of the agreement is South Korea's commitment to invest $350 billion in the U.S. economy. Notably, $150 billion of this investment will be dedicated to supporting the construction of U.S. warships, bolstering the nation's naval capabilities, a sector experiencing decline in the United States. South Korea successfully avoided crossing previously established red lines, particularly concerning further liberalization of its rice and beef markets, a move that would have triggered widespread protests from domestic farmers. This demonstrates a careful negotiation process prioritizing South Korea's agricultural sector. The deal represents a strategic move by South Korea to achieve a more equitable trade relationship with the U.S., positioning itself competitively within the global market. The investment underscores a long-term commitment to strengthening economic ties between the two countries, aiming to address imbalances and foster mutual prosperity. The meeting is expected to further refine the details of this agreement, solidifying a framework for future trade relations. UK Political and Global News Digest news coverage reveals a complex web of developments across multiple sectors. Donald Trump's administration is reportedly preventing Ukraine from utilizing US-made long-range missiles to strike Russian territory, a move intended to encourage negotiations with Vladimir Putin. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, however, asserts Ukraine has developed its own long-range weaponry and no longer requires American approval. Simultaneously, a YouGov poll indicates a significant portion of the public, nearly three-quarters, believe Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is mishandling the issue of asylum seekers housed in hotels, reflecting growing public concern. The impending publication of Virginia Gifford's memoir is generating considerable attention. The book, completed before Gifford's suicide, promises intimate, disturbing, and heartbreaking details regarding accusations of abuse involving the Duke of York and Jeffrey Epstein. Victims of Epstein are claiming U.S. officials facilitated a stage for Trump, and the book aims to expose systemic failures in trafficking cases. The Sun brands the memoir Virginia's Revenge. Politically, the focus remains on the small boats crisis. Ministers are advocating for a more radical approach, while a YouGov poll suggests 71% believe Starmer is mishandling the situation. A proposed fast-track appeals process for migrants is under consideration, but its operationalization is expected to take months. Mirroring a previous Labour-introduced process deemed unlawful, Labour MP Tonia Antoniazzi reports a sharp rise in online abuse and death threats directed at politicians, described as worse than the Brexit years. Economically, private equity firms are facing a profitability crisis due to higher interest rates and declining deal-making, leading to a 30% reduction in fundraising since 2021. The Daily Star celebrates a rare, rain-free August bank holiday Monday, with temperatures expected to reach 29°C, hotter than Morocco. Furthermore, the Trump administration's decision to limit Ukraine's missile strikes underscores a strategic realignment within the ongoing conflict. The situation highlights ongoing political tensions, legal battles, and economic challenges within the UK and globally. Supreme Court warns lower courts to uphold emergency orders. Recent Supreme Court activity, largely focused on cases involving President Donald Trump, reveals a growing concern among conservative justices regarding lower court interpretations of emergency orders. The court has increasingly asserted its authority, issuing several rulings that directly contradict decisions made by federal judges, signaling a desire for greater control over the judicial process. Several justices, most notably Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, have explicitly cautioned lower courts to treat the Supreme Court's emergency orders as binding precedent, emphasizing that these orders are not merely temporary measures, but rather definitive instructions for lower courts. This stance has been met with criticism from some legal scholars who argue that the court's actions demonstrate a lack of transparency and a disregard for established judicial norms. The court's interventions have centered on a variety of cases, including the cancellation of nearly $800 million in National Institutes of Health research grants and the firing of Consumer Product Safety Commission members. In each instance, the court relied on earlier emergency orders to justify its decisions, prompting accusations that the justices are prioritizing the executive branch's agenda over judicial independence. Justice Samuel Alito's sharp criticism of a federal judge's ruling in a Trump policy case, labeling it an act of judicial hubris, highlights the escalating tensions. The court's willingness to overturn lower court decisions, even those based on significant arguments against the administration's actions, underscores a strategic effort to shape the legal landscape. The Supreme Court's recent ruling on nationwide injunctions, which effectively limited the power of lower courts to block executive policies, represents a significant shift in judicial authority. The court's emphasis on short-term emergency orders and its demand for lower courts to get it right reflects a desire to assert greater control and potentially influence the direction of legal challenges. Justice Elena Kagan has voiced concerns about the court's lack of explanation for its emergency orders, urging for greater clarity. Justice Kavanaugh has defended the court's approach, emphasizing the judiciary's role in maintaining independence and correcting errors. The Supreme Court's actions are prompting debate about the proper role of the judiciary in a democratic system, particularly concerning the balance between judicial review and the executive branch's agenda. The court's strategy, according to some, is a deliberate attempt to shape the legal landscape and assert its dominance in the federal judiciary. The Netanyahu strategy, a shifting approach to the Gaza conflict. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dramatically altered his strategy regarding the Gaza conflict, shifting from phased ceasefire negotiations to demanding a comprehensive agreement that includes the complete disarmament of Hamas, the release of all hostages, and Israeli security control over Gaza. This shift comes amidst ongoing military preparations for a major offensive on Gaza City and significant influence from the Trump administration. Despite accepting a Hamas proposed ceasefire deal, Netanyahu has refused to commit, prioritizing military action and maintaining a war and peace dual strategy. The catalyst for this change appears to be the perceived threat of a US-backed offensive. Donald Trump has strongly advocated for the total destruction of Hamas, publicly urging Israel to confront and destroy the group and expressing impatience with the partial negotiation process. Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, slammed Hamas as uncoordinated and lacking genuine intent to negotiate, further fueling Netanyahu's determination for a take-all approach. This strategy has drawn criticism from Israeli families of hostages, who accuse Netanyahu of sacrificing their loved ones by delaying or dismissing the existing ceasefire proposal. Protests have intensified, reflecting deep frustration with the government's perceived intransigence. The U.S. administration, while privately expressing concerns about Netanyahu's approach, has maintained a discreet stance, largely due to Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar's withdrawal from negotiations following the observed split between the U.S. and Israel. Netanyahu's coalition government, particularly comprised of far-right figures Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, vehemently oppose any ceasefire or end to the war, presenting a significant obstacle to a negotiated settlement. The government's insistence on maintaining full security control over Gaza, a condition deemed unacceptable by Hamas, is hindering progress. Despite repeated polling indicating widespread public support for a hostage deal, Netanyahu's strategy continues, fueled by the belief that Hamas will never accept his terms. The Prime Minister's dual messaging, simultaneously pursuing war and peace, aims to buy time and maintain his political position. The ongoing conflict and Netanyahu's calculated maneuvering are prolonging the war and potentially endangering the lives of the remaining hostages. Ukraine's Independence Day marked by continued fighting and international support. Ukraine marked its Independence Day on Sunday amidst ongoing military operations and a surge in international support. President Volodymyr Zelensky reiterated Ukraine's commitment to continuing the fight for a secure and peaceful future, emphasizing the nation's determination and resilience. The day saw significant developments, including a prisoner exchange involving 146 soldiers from both sides, alongside the return of journalist Dmytro Kulyak, who had been held captive since the start of the war. Canada pledged continued military assistance, with a $2,000 billion package including drones, ammunition, and armored vehicles slated for delivery as early as September. U.S. Envoy Keith Kellogg received the Order of Merit from Zelensky, and U.S. President Donald Trump expressed his intention to consider further economic sanctions or withdrawal from peace talks. International partners announced substantial aid packages. Norway committed 7 billion kroner ($1,440 a 693 million) towards air defense systems, alongside Germany, while the UK government confirmed ongoing military training for Ukrainian soldiers until at least 2026. Sweden and Ukraine agreed to joint defense production, with Sweden bolstering its rearmament and supplying defense material to Ukraine. Despite diplomatic efforts, including a meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska, progress towards a peace deal remains elusive. Trump has voiced frustration and is contemplating further sanctions or a withdrawal from negotiations. Russian forces continued their slow advance in eastern Ukraine, seizing 2 villages in the Donetsk region. The ongoing conflict has spurred a global response, with nations reinforcing their commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Zelensky highlighted the importance of international support, citing a letter from King Charles, expressing admiration for the Ukrainian people's spirit. The UK confirmed continued military support and ongoing training, while Sweden and Ukraine agreed on a joint defense production strategy. The situation remains volatile, with ongoing fighting and complex diplomatic efforts shaping the future of the conflict. Russia's expanding global media influence and Russian state-backed media, particularly RT and Sputnik, are actively expanding their international presence, coinciding with Western restrictions imposed following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This expansion focuses on regions outside the West, utilizing a strategy of tailored messaging designed to exploit existing geopolitical tensions and perceptions of Western dominance. The core of the story centers on RT's efforts to gain traction in countries like Chile, Algeria, Ethiopia, and across Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. This involves establishing local bureaus, offering training programs for journalists, and adapting content to resonate with specific audiences. Simultaneously, Sputnik has expanded its reach through newsrooms in Ethiopia and other nations, offering coverage in multiple languages. Despite Western bans on RT's broadcast and its removal from platforms like YouTube, the channel continues to operate and attract significant online views, though the exact number remains disputed. The strategy relies on presenting a counter-narrative to the Western portrayal of the conflict, often framing the invasion as a response to NATO expansion and a defense of the global South. This expansion is facilitated by a perceived weakening of Western media influence, stemming from budget cuts and shifting foreign policy priorities. Critics point to the success of RT in garnering support in countries like Bolivia, Mali, Nicaragua, South Africa, and Uganda, where the narrative of Russia as a victim of Western aggression has found resonance. The effectiveness of this strategy is underscored by the fact that some audiences, particularly in Africa, appear receptive to RT's perspective, despite evidence of Russian war crimes and disinformation. RT's training programs for journalists further contribute to this influence, equipping local reporters with skills to produce and disseminate content aligned with the Kremlin's objectives. Ultimately, the story highlights a deliberate effort by Russia to challenge Western hegemony through media influence, capitalizing on geopolitical vulnerabilities and exploiting divisions within the global landscape. The ongoing expansion of RT and Sputnik represents a significant shift in the information environment and raises concerns about the potential for further manipulation and the erosion of trust in traditional media sources. Donbas under siege evacuations and escalating conflict. On the BBC reports on the deteriorating situation in the Donbas region of Ukraine, specifically focusing on the town of Dobropilya, a key battleground amidst Russia's ongoing offensive. With Moscow controlling approximately 70% of Donetsk and much of Luhansk, Vladimir Putin aims for full control, and fighting continues daily. Humanitarian volunteers Lars and Varia operate through Universal Aid Ukraine, facilitating evacuations for residents fleeing relentless attacks. Dobropilya is largely abandoned, with buildings severely damaged and residents seeking refuge. Drone activity is pervasive, with multiple Russian drones detected, necessitating constant vigilance and evasive maneuvers. The evacuation process is frequently disrupted by shelling and drone strikes, highlighting the immediate danger faced by civilians. The town's strategic importance as part of Ukraine's fortress belt underscores the escalating stakes. The conflict's impact is dramatically illustrated through visits to a National Guard field hospital operated by the 14th Operational Brigade. Medics led by Senior Lieutenant Dima treat a steady stream of casualties, primarily from fighting around Pokrovsk, a city Russia has been attempting to seize for a year. The injuries are severe, largely due to drone strikes, and the sheer volume of casualties is overwhelming. Despite the perilous circumstances, residents like Anton, a local, express a desire for a negotiated resolution, advocating for a peaceful outcome without bloodshed. However, Varia, another resident, remains skeptical of Russia's intentions and believes surrendering Donbas would only embolden further attacks. The situation is characterized by a high cost in Ukrainian soldiers' lives and body parts, with Russian casualties reportedly 3 times higher due to their greater capacity for absorbing losses. The constant drone activity and relentless fighting demonstrate the extreme challenges faced by Ukrainian forces and civilians alike. The strategic importance of Donbas, particularly Dobropilya, is critical to Ukraine's defense, and its loss would significantly increase the risk to neighboring regions. The urgency of the situation is compounded by the desire for a lasting peace, while simultaneously confronting the brutal reality of the ongoing conflict.